This video is going to explain the formation of glacial ice. So when glacial ice forms, there's a number of different stages in that process. For glacial ice to form, we basically need to have snow first of all. So the first stage in our process is snow falling. That snow then turns into something called neve, which then turns into something called firn, until we eventually get our glacial ice. And this whole process takes somewhere between 40 and 50 years. For the purposes of higher geography, you don't really need to know the differences between neve and firn. We'll talk about them both in sort of a similar stage. But essentially what's happening here is you've got light fluffy snow, which is not very dense, lots of air in it, which basically gets denser and denser, all the air squeezed out until we eventually get to ice. So the first stage in this, as I said before, we have to have snow. So snow falls, nice fluffy snowflakes, and it builds up. Now it's particularly builds up in two places. The first one is on northeast slopes and also at high altitudes. So northeast slopes is obviously because we have less direct sunlight here. So to do with the aspect. And at high altitudes, obviously it's colder, a colder climate. And when we combine the cold climate and the less direct sunlight, what that essentially means is we have less melting. So snow particularly tends to build up in these areas because there is less melting, and that means the snow therefore then stays all year round. So this kind of leads into the second stage here. So the snow line is a point on a hill or mountain where anywhere above that line, the snow stays all year round. So it might melt a wee bit in the summer, but it will stay for the full year, it won't fully melt. And what that essentially means is that more snow will then fall on top of last year's snow. So you're in this position where the snow from last year is still there and the fresh snow then falls on top. So that's how we tend to get these layers. So as we saw in that picture, you can see the glacial ice tends to form in layers, and this is why. So we end up with nice fluffy snowflakes initially. So excuse me, because I'm not very good at drawing snowflakes. So here's what is roughly a nice fluffy snowflake. So I'm sure you all have seen snowflakes before when they sort of land on your jacket and they're all nice and fluffy and they have sorts of lots of air in them. So fluffy snowflakes, which, as I say at the top, and then gradually they will start to sort of melt a wee bit, freeze a wee bit, and the new snow falls on top. So what kind of happens down here is you end up with sort of last year's snow, which isn't really quite as nice anymore. The fluff has sort of come away from them a wee bit as they've sort of melted around the edges and then frozen again. So this is last year's snow. And you end up with more fluffy snowflakes from this year on top. And then when we have our new snow falling on top, over several years, the snow basically starts to build up. So we've got snowfall, snowfall, and snowfall, and more snow on top of the other. And a few things happen here. So the first thing is that the air is squeezed out. So if you imagine having snow on top of snow on top of snow, it's getting heavier and heavier and it's pushing out a lot of the air. And there's also repeated melting and refreezing. So the snow will melt a little bit when it gets a wee bit warm, maybe in some sunlight. It starts to melt a little bit, then it will get cold overnight and it will refreeze again. And every time that happens, more and more sort of this ice and neve and firn start to form. So this forms our neve, and then it turns into firn. And base is now like sort of granules or almost like crystallized snow. So before we had the nice fluffy snowflakes that were starting to sort of wear away, and now we basically have almost like snowy sort of granules, as I say, that have sort of melted and refreeze. And again, there's much less air in here. So you sort of have granules of what we tend to call crystallized snow. And that basically continues to happen until after about 40 to 50 years, we get more compression, more accumulation, and then we basically have our glacial ice. So glacial ice is very dense, it's crystalline, ice, and often it's actually blue in colour because it's so dense compared to sort of the snow. And once it has built up enough thickness, it'll start to move downhill due to its weight and gravity. So once it's thick enough, it'll be able to move downhill basically under gravity, and that's when it can start to shape the landscape, start to transport materials, and those are the things we'll be looking at when we start to look at the formation of our glacial features.